Many people have asked me what I'm going to be talking about, and I said I don't quite know, because I tend to let the talks just happen in their own organic sort of mycelial way. So that's what's going to happen today and now. I thought about whether to stop exactly 1:30, because if people want to go and see Graham Hancock. But as Tom just pointed out, it's now 20 past, so we'll do the full half an hour. But if people do want to go see Graham Hancock, I suggest you go now, because it's nearly he's about to talk quite soon. But if not, that's what catching up on YouTube is all about, isn't it? No, please do. I'm being. His talk is going to be very good. So I'm not sending everyone away. I'm saying if that was your plan, then probably do it now. Say that again.
You're better than Graham Hancock.
Anyway, I better get started. So first of all, I'm going to respond to Ash's question of who are the gnome. I've been exploring this by asking who are the she for a very long time. Who are the she is what William Butler Yeats asked, as we heard about Yeats in Rob's talk earlier. And I did actually think, well, maybe I might recite a poem. Now, Christine, you've heard me do this before. I wasn't going to, but seeing as he actually brought up, this is Rob in the first talk, which is an excellent talk, by the way. He brought up William Butler Yeats. He brought up the whole Celtic revival at the time of Yeats with Lady Gregory and Lady Wilde and various others, A. Russell. And he also mentioned the stolen child. And so I thought, well, why not? Where dips the rocky highland of Sleuthwood in the lake, there lies a leafy island, where flapping herons wake the drowsy water rats, and there we've hid our fairy vats, filled with berries and the reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the silver moonlight glosses the thin grey sands with light, far out by farthest Rosses, we foot it all the night, weaving olden dances, mingling hands and mingling glances, till the moon has taken flight. To and fro we leap, and chase the frothy bubbles, while the world, still full of troubles, lies anxious in its sleep. Come away, human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the tumbling water gushes from the fields above Glencar, in fields among the rushes that scarce would bathe a star, we seek for slumbering trout and give them unquiet dreams, leaning softly out from ferns that drip their tears of dew into the young streams. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Away with us! He's going, the solemn-eyed. No more he'll hear the lolling of the cows on the warm hillside, or the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast, or see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest. For he's come, the human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than he can understand, So there we are. That's, thank you. That is The Stolen Child by W.B. Yeats, which was published in 1888, which then, 100 years later, the Waterboys used in their album Fisherman's Blues. And for those of you who know that, it's a beautiful album, 100 years later. I hadn't intended to recite that, but Rob's talk kind of has set me off. I had actually intended to recite a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, so if there's time at the end, I might still do that. If not, it doesn't matter. So where was I going? We are addressing who are the she, who are the gnomes, what are the gnomes, where are the gnomes? But I'm also asking today, I'm going to be talking about thresholds. This is my intention, thresholds. Thresholds are areas of transition. Thresholds are the threshing floor, the place where things are separated, the place where the grain is separated from the stalk and from the chaff, where if you're lucky, a bit of wind will blow through and take away all the dust, leaving you the grain. That's the threshing place. The threshold is a place of work, a place of transition from one to the next. And of course, it's important to cross the thresholds. So my intention today is to talk about thresholds and to present thresholds in a way of thinking like a mushroom and all that entails, thinking in terms of mycelial networks, thinking in terms of what a mycelial way of looking at reality, what Bob Anton Wilson would call a reality tunnel, or BS, what looking at the world through a mycelial reality tunnel, how does it appear? How do we interact with the world in such a way? And of course, that's where we'll find the gnome and the she. So the first threshold I'd like to talk about, and it's extraordinary, Nicoletta's just this minute rushed out. She's gone to work the stall of the UKC Psychedelic Society. Now, what is UKC? The University of Kent. I work at the University of Kent. The Psychedelic Society at the University of Kent is the oldest psychedelic society, student psychedelic society in any university in the country. And it is a pioneer activity. Think pioneering. Think about the mosses and liverworts. Think about, for example, things like birch that pioneers new land. It's the pioneers that work so hard to set the scene for succession. So breaking convention owes a lot to the first breaking convention at the University of Kent in 2011. All the people from the Psychedelic Society, the students, but also the staff, the many staff were involved. It was out of that the first breaking convention came. So there's a lovely sort of organic quality here. And look, here's one of the originals. Go on, wave your hand in the air. There you are. There's Ollie. One of the originals, one of the founders, one of the pioneers. It feels good. Now, every year, I do talks for the Psychedelic Society. I do workshops. I do trips around trees. We go and meet the trees. We go to the labyrinth to say hello to the labyrinth, to walk the labyrinth, to look at the full moon, the new moon, to celebrate the seasons. We do all sorts of things, but very often it's lecture theatre stuff because that's the format of a university. And I do my best to introduce the weirdest stuff I possibly can. And one of the questions I've asked many times, especially in the first session, and it's a session that I've given many times, it's always different, but the session is called, So What is Psychedelic Anyway? And it's kind of, we've heard a lot of those sort of talks already today, the last few days, about trying to understand what this term means and all its ramifications. We'll never get to the end of that. So I'm asking people, especially people who've just signed up, so people in their first year at university, so why have you signed up to the Psychedelic Society? What was it that intrigued you about this? How did you end up signing along the piece of paper when you were in the Freshers' Fair, where all the student societies are advertising their wares, so you could sign up for paintballing, or pony trekking, or swimming in the sea, which is probably swimming in sewage, or canoeing, or Dungeons and Dragons, or the Marxist Society, or the Conservative Society. I don't think there's much crossover there between the Psychedelic Society and the Conservatives, but you never know. So I ask people, and I get them to talk, tell me what was it? And always the answers are quite similar, and the answers are around the notion of something transgressive, something taboo, something edgy like at the edge, something ultimately that they had not thought was really allowed. Really? I know pony trekking's okay, but this is Psychedelic Society. Do you guys really talk about this stuff? And we do. And of course, that's a threshold that they've passed. A threshold simply by going up to the stall and saying, there's my name, there's my email, here's my £3. It's probably gone up now. And that means something. It's about crossing a threshold. So I've worked on that, and I continue to work on that in terms of what thresholds mean when we cross them, and what are the implications of that. So the first threshold that I would suggest to talk about is a simple recognition that weird shit happens. I got a nod. Thank you. Yeah, weird shit happens. And I really think this is an important thing to recognize, because it can help a lot of people to recognize that their experiences, and they don't have to be psychedelic experiences, they often are. Experience of precognition, dreams, experiences of apparitions of perhaps a relative, maybe at the time that they were passing on, maybe at the time that they were dying, and they appear in a dream form. Communication with an ancestor, communication with a dead relative or a living relative, but in such a way that's not email or WhatsApp. Yeah? Lots of people have strange experiences, but of course the dominant ideological framework of our culture, as we all know, is one that discredits that. It's either contained very much within a very specific religious place, So I saw, I had an experience with the Blessed Virgin Mary or with Jesus, or, it's permitted there within the religious context, or it's within a psychopathological context, i.e. you're nuts, right? I think that's very unhealthy. I think it's much more healthy to say weird shit happens to all of us, or at least it can. Luckily, it doesn't happen all the time. If it did, we wouldn't be able to rely on a fairly stable and at times fairly inert reality. But simply recognizing that weird shit happens, I think, is very important. If we open up what that weird shit is, it's everything. Everything that's usually consigned to the world of psi, the world of paraphenomena, parapsychology, para this, para that, or as my dear friend Jack Hunter calls, and I love this word, anomalistics. Anomalistics, that's a great word. Now, crossing that threshold then takes us to a threshold that I've been crossing pretty much all my life, and I find it very, very, very important. And that is a recognition of the world around us as being living and sentient. Now, I know that we all know that. Some of us have, some people have pets, You'd never tell an English person that his cat or his dog is not living, sentient, and with a personality of itself, We all experience the notion that the living world is sentient, but the profound sense of the living world is sentient is very, very different. And that's where there's an interaction with the living world. And I'm talking woodlands in particular, because that's my environment. Ash was talking about the Sonoran Desert. I live in East Kent. It's a very different kind of environment. But nevertheless, wilderness is always there. You just have to, zone down a little bit. You might even have to stand beside the motorway and look in the grass verges there, or in the tangles between the warehouses. That's where wilderness happens in my environment, and in the woodlands. But the woodlands, very often, the best woodlands are the ones which are actually in a rather awkward place, sort of behind the industrial centre, the industrial site. Nobody goes there. That's where near the railway lines, they're always good ones. Woodlands by railway lines are great. I hang out in these places, and I shouldn't have said that, should I? But that's where the wild happens. Now, let's just focus on this a little bit more. This is very important, and this is where there's a vast and wonderful literature. I thought about bringing all sorts of citations, but I think, just like Ash said, you can read the stuff, Sam Gandy in particular, he's just one name out of many, Hunter Kellen. There are various others that he's been working with, some of which Chris Timmerman talked about this morning in his talk, looking at this experience through the word ecodelia. Ecodelia is really interesting. I like this word. I think it's a valuable word. I think it has purchase. Ecodelia is essentially a form of biophilia. Now, biophilia, we look at the entomologist E.O. Wilson, who's a very inspiring writer. I like his work. E.O. Wilson, he didn't coin the expression, but he certainly popularized the expression of biophilia, which is this inherent love of the biosphere, the natural world, of the world in which we live, beyond the human. And that biophilic nature is something which we would expect to be everywhere, but it's clearly not. And it's clearly not when we're seeing the destruction. Now, in my part of the land, I'm seeing this destruction all the time. Woodlands are cleared all the time. And I learned that expression from Dave Forstmann, which is land scalping. Now, land scalping, as we know what it means, because we've all seen it, especially when they're building new roads that we don't need. We really don't need. When you see land scalping, you can tell that what's motivating that entire activity, from the men with the big yellow diggers to the pen pushers who are pushing all the documents, is a profoundly biophobic position. It is a biophobic position. If you can casually sign away an entire woodland, I feel that in the same degree as if you can casually sign away an entire population of people. We are talking about people. We are talking about the deep, deep, rich traditions that are within a woodland. Now, those traditions are deep, and you only need to go to a badger set to know that. A lot of badger sets are very, very old, and we've got generations and generations and generations of badger. That is badger culture, badger language, badger traditions, badger forms of passing on knowledge, badger wisdom, all of which you will see some pen pusher could say, well, we'll close that set, we'll move the badgers to somewhere else. The badgers in Hythe, I just heard the other day, are returning to the set that was bulldozed. They're returning because the passages and tunnels go very, very deep. They were all translocated elsewhere. They've returned. I think that's beautiful. Of course, they'll be translocated back, although they'll probably be poisoned. I have no idea. But it's a very interesting idea that there is a biophilic and a biophobic aspect to us all. And what I find particularly interesting, and this is where the whole literature around ecodelia is really interesting, I find, is that so often, a awakening to that biophilic position or sense is assisted through psychedelic and other anomalous experiences, experiences which are just a change of consciousness, a change of the everyday consciousness. And I insist about psychedelics as not necessarily being a substance that's ingested. Just yesterday, somebody asked me, what's my favorite psychedelic? And I said, literature. And I really mean that. I mean that very seriously. My weirdest experiences in all my life have happened through the tangle of author, narrator, character, and then myself within literature is a very psychedelic experience. At least it can be. So that threshold, I think, is an important one. That threshold is a interaction with the natural world when you perceive and relate to the natural world. And I'm talking, in my case, as I said, woodlands, as fellow passengers aboard Spaceship Earth, as fellow beings, as brothers and sisters. And that has to be felt. It can't be cognitive. It can't be a cognitive sort of a concept. It has to be felt. And when it's felt, it's profound. And again, if you start to read so many of the accounts, you will see that many people, for example, travel to Peru, go on to drink ayahuasca, and then for the first time in their life, they experience the jungle, the woods around them, as being alive in a way which they'd never experienced. And that experience then stays with them. Other people, as you no doubt know, will have eaten psilocybin that we heard so much about in Rob's talk earlier. And with that psilocybin, it awakens them to suddenly the fields around them, the meadows, the river, that woodland on the far hillside, are alive in a different way. Now, this takes me to the next threshold, and this is a very interesting threshold, because at this stage, effectively, once you've gone past the original threshold of weird shit can happen, then you're on the next threshold, which is the natural world is alive around us. But then, of course, you are in this completely inseparable, indistinguishable zone between what constitutes a physical sense of being, that oak tree there, and the spirit of the oak tree, the spirit of the woodland, the she, the good folk, the gentry, fairy, the gnomes, pixies, goblins, hobgoblins, knockers and kobolds, all the rich panoply in these islands alone of the wee folk. Now, what's so important there is look back in the entire, this is another massive area of my exploration. I've been exploring people, I've been exploring explorers. I've been reading with great attention the writings of people such as W.Y. Evans Vence, who is known to some of you probably as the translator of the Tibetan Book of the Dead that Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner then drew on. But he published in the early part of the 20th century his account of the folk and fairy tales of the British Isles. And he was inspired by W.B. Yeats. Yeats before him, we heard earlier in Rob's talk, Yeats published the long account, which he then worked with Lady Gregory and Lady Wilde, of the folk tales of the Irish peasantry, which is where he published Stolen Child. And it goes back, especially in the Victorian times, especially around the Society for Psychical Research, and then later, the time of the Edwardian times, the time of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, with the College of Psychic Studies. Tremendous body of ethnographic literature coming in about these folk tales. And according from Yeats's position, of course, what he was discovering was a mythic narrative to rival the Greeks, to rival the ancient Egyptians. This was, especially that you can see the sort of the colonial aspect here of Yeats saying our lands have been subjugated by the English for so long, including our legends, including our myths. And therefore he was, this resurgence of the power of these stories. Now, let's get into those stories. So often in those accounts, the presence of one of the woodland sprites or an undine in the river is not seen as a individual, solid, clear, identifiable form. Just imagine you're in the woodland and a deer comes past. You're spellbound. You can see the deer. There is the deer. You then move too brusquely and the deer gets startled and off he goes. But you saw the deer. On the winter solstice, I saw a kingfisher on the River Stour near Exeter, between Exeter and Chartham. I took that as a great omen, but I definitely saw the kingfisher. It was there. It flew along the river. This beautiful flash of blue. But the thing with the fairies, with the pixies, with all these wonderful, they go by many other names as well, spirits, is that they are indistinguishable from the world in which they appear. So a leaf flutters. Was it a fairy? No, it was a leaf. Was it a fairy? Was it a leaf? The water gurgles in a sudden way. It sounds a bit like laughter. So therefore, the spirits of the natural world and the natural world cannot be separated. You cannot say, oh, and people do, no, people will, so I shouldn't be so axiomatic here. But I find it difficult to say that there is a living, sentient tree without saying there is a living, sentient spirit of that tree. In fact, those two things are the same. And therefore, this threshold that I'm talking about is this understanding that to landscape, to clear a woodland for the building of a horrible concrete new railway, such as HS2, but let's not get into that, and to clear all the woodlands in this wonderful sustainable project is to clear more than just an ecosystem. Or at least it's to clear more than an ecosystem on a horizontal basis. It's to clear an ecosystem that stretches out multidimensionally, across time, backwards in time, of all the tradition that's gone, forwards in time, of all the tradition that's lost. It's a multidimensional landscaping, which is the motivation of a profoundly biophobic position. All of which, as we've seen from the literature, is, and from our own experiences, no doubt, are challenged. Those positions are challenged by a deep reverie in the woodland and with a few mushrooms floating around the system very often helps. Now that's a very, very profound position that I feel here. And I read Aldo Leopold, this is a few years ago, I read Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, and it's a work I recommend to you all. It's fantastic. And he writes this wonderful account of shooting a wolf. But the shooting of the wolf was when he saw the green fire slowly die in the wolf's eye. And it was then that he understood. It was then that he understood that neither the wolf nor the mountain wanted that death, the death that he had just caused. And then this was his profound understanding, that he needed to think like a mountain. He needed to think like a mountain. And thinking like a mountain was a complete change of framework, a complete change of relating to the world. And if you have a chance to read Sand County Almanac, you'll see that there's a deep, profound biophilic aspect to that. And he's also sort of a very founding writer in terms of rewilding and wilderness and that relationship with the wilderness for those same reasons. And then a couple of years, 2020, I was reading Merlin Sheldrake's phenomenal book, Entangled Life. And again, if you haven't had a chance to read it, do so. Buy it, read it, love it, keep it, hand it to your friends, buy lots of copies and give it around. Yeah? Don't worry, I'm not an agent. That would be, I don't work for his publishers. No, it's a good book. But Merlin says in the book, he says, when I'm working with mushrooms, I tend to think like a mushroom. And therefore I thought, okay, so bringing Aldo Leopold and Merlin Sheldrake together, thinking like a mountain, thinking like a mushroom, what does it mean to think like a mushroom? Is this about the 1 minute gun or the what minute gun, 5 minute gun? Well, I'll end now, right? I will end by saying, what does it mean to think like a mushroom? Now, let's just think about Amy's Nikki, yesterday, in the opening address, she had that fantastic image, I hope you all liked it, which is that there's this mycelial network. And this conference is a fruiting body. It'll appear, and then it'll sort of die back, or maybe get eaten by the flies, or maybe get picked by somebody. That doesn't really matter. But that notion is really important because the way Nikki presented it, I found very profound, because she's presenting all the work that we're all doing as being these subtle filaments spreading out into the earth, transmitting information, transmitting knowledge, transmitting compassion, transmitting love, transmitting acting. And as you know, I've once heard somebody presenting mycelial networks as being shallow hierarchies, and I said, no, I don't get that at all. They're not shallow hierarchies. They are networks, these little nodal points that form. And then the information and the nutrients and the minerals spread out. And then those nodes will fall away, and new nodes will form, and new nodes will fall away. There's no beginning and an end. There's no edge. The edge of a mycelial network is simply where there's the cliff. But then it'll just sort of, mycelial network. It can be chopped down the middle and then it'll re-heal. Mycelial networks, again, I don't have a sort of a better way of presenting it, but just to sort of ask you to do that in your own way. Imagine looking at the world from a mycelial way. Imagine looking at a world which goes completely against so many of the dominant hierarchical and stratified and structured ordering dynamics of society that we're all encouraged to believe, with the rich people and the clever people at the top, and then everything's ordered. That's the way that we're trained to see the world. Whereas to see the world, to think like a mushroom, is to see it in a very different way. And of course, it's to see it in a profoundly biophilic way. Now, I will end with the poem which I thought I might read, but I was a bit, spun in a different direction by Rob. I will end just with the last, or should I do the whole thing? I'll do the whole thing. There you are. That'll do. Okay. It's by Gerard Manley Hopkins, a lovely poet. You don't necessarily have to go along with his theology, which I don't, but his relationship with the woods and the trees is just amazing. And it's called Inverness. And I did think about reading this because I went for a walk along the River Exe. Now, the River Exe flows out of Exmoor, hence the name. And the word Exe just means river, and it's the same as Axe, as in Axminster and Axmouth. Okay, so we're on the river. Just like the river Avon means river, so that's the river. And Wadi means river, so the Guadalquivir in Spain means the river Quivir. So there you go. Anyway, I wasn't going to talk about that. So the Exe flows out of Exmoor in a place called Simmonsbath, and it's a lovely boggy place. Interestingly enough, where lots of mushrooms grow, as I know. Simmonsbath is a cool place. Go and check it out. It's a long way from here, way up in Exmoor. But that's where the River Exe kind of first forms out of the marshy, boggy ground. And because I went for this walk along the River Exe the other day, I thought, well, I'll tell you what, I'll do that poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins. It's about a river in Scotland, but it's the ending that really, and I will not say another word when I finish. It's called Inverness. This darksome burn, horse black brown, his roll rock high roads roaring down, in coop and in comb, the fleece of his foam flutes, and down to the lake falls home. A wind-puff bonnet of fawn froth turns and trembles over the broth of a pool, so pitch black, fell frowning, it rounds and rounds despair to drowning. Degged with dew, dappled with dew, are the groins of the braes that the brook threads through. Wiry heath packs, flitches of fern, and the bead bonny ash that sits over the burn. What would the world be once bereft of wildness and wet? Let them be left. Oh, let them be left, wildness and wet, Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. There we go. There you are. Good. Was that worth missing Graham Hancock for?
Yes. That was great.
Good.